She put $172 worth of imported caviar, aged cheese, and wine into a shopping cart, turned to me at the register with the calm expectation of someone who has always been served, and said she hadn't brought her wallet. I placed my single container of kefir on the conveyor belt, paid $3.90, picked up my bag, and walked out through the automatic doors without looking back. What followed destroyed the careful fiction I had been maintaining for 4 years, the fiction that we were a family, that I was loved, that the money quietly leaving our accounts each month was generosity freely given rather than a toll I had never agreed to pay. But to understand what happened after that Saturday in October, you need to understand what came before it, the years of small, incremental erosions that I had been calling adjustment and compromise and being a good wife, when the more accurate word, the one I wasn't ready to use yet, was something closer to disappearance. A beginning, then. The real one. My name is Mara Voss. I was 31 years old and I had been married to Daniel Voss for 4 years and 3 months when the grocery store incident happened. I am a graphic designer. I worked then, as I do now, for a mid-sized marketing agency, handling brand identity projects and the occasional packaging redesign that pays well enough to feel meaningful and badly enough to remind you it's still a job. I worked mostly from home 3 days a week, which I loved with the specific, territorial love of someone who has discovered that silence is not empty but full of a particular kind of productive quiet she didn't know she needed. Our house was a 2-bedroom with a neglected garden I had been slowly reclaiming for 2 years, pulling the overgrown rose bushes back into shape, laying down new soil in the beds along the back fence, planting lavender along the path from the gate because I read somewhere that it calmed you down just to brush past it, and I had become a person who needed calming down in small, invisible ways I wasn't fully acknowledging yet. The kitchen had good southwestern light that came in hard and yellow in the mornings and turned soft and amber by mid-afternoon. And I had arranged my work table near the window because I liked that progression, the way the day changed its character without announcing it. Daniel and I had a savings account designated specifically for a renovation project, the 2nd bedroom, which we were going to convert into a proper studio for me, with built-in shelving along the north wall and a glass-paneled door and enough electrical outlets to run everything I needed without the octopus of power strips I'd been living with for 2 years. We had been contributing to that account for 14 months. We were, at the point this story begins, $1,100 away from our target figure. Daniel was a structural engineer at a firm that did mostly commercial work, office buildings, parking structures, the occasional pedestrian bridge that he was quietly proud of in a way he found slightly embarrassing to admit. He was thorough and methodical and he thought in load-bearing terms about everything, not just buildings. He thought about arguments that way, and finances, and relationships, always checking for where the weight was distributed, what was bearing the stress, what might fail under pressure. He had warm, dark eyes and a laugh that arrived without warning and took over his whole face, and 6 years and I still liked that laugh in the involuntary, slightly helpless way you like something you didn't choose. He was a good man in most of the ways that are easy to see and in some of the ways that are harder to identify. And he had one significant structural flaw that I had been working around for 4 years the way you work around a load-bearing wall you cannot remove, his mother. Her name was Valentina. She was 63 years old, still angular and precise in the way certain women maintain through the application of pure personal discipline, with silver hair she wore and a chignon so perfectly executed that I had never once, in 4 years of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings and unexpected drop-in visits, seen it come loose. She wore a particular perfume, dense, floral, the kind that adhered to upholstery and drapes and lingered for days after she'd left a room, so that every Monday morning I could still find traces of her in the couch cushions and the guest bathroom towels, and every time I caught that smell my shoulders tightened by about half an inch without my permission. She had opinions about my cooking, my housekeeping, the organizational system I used for the linen closet, the particular shade of blue I had painted the hallway. Too cold, she said, when I told her the color name, as if the name itself were evidence of my poor judgment. She delivered these opinions warmly, consistently, and without apparent awareness that they were unwelcome, prefacing each one with "I only mention it because I love you like my own daughter." I had heard that phrase enough times that it had ceased to carry meaning the way a word does when you repeat it too many times in a row and it becomes just sound. I had never once felt like her daughter. I had always felt like a contractor she was mildly dissatisfied with but hadn't yet found grounds to replace. The Sunday dinners at Valentina and Oleg's apartment were a fixed feature of my life, twice a month, rotating through the seasons with the reliable unchangingness of a dental appointment. Oleg was Daniel's father, a gentle, quiet man who grew tomatoes on a crowded balcony and had a habit of appearing at precisely the right moment to offer someone more tea, as if he had a sixth sense for emotional weather and responded to it with hot beverages. He had, years before I entered the picture, made a profound and apparently permanent peace with his wife's personality through a strategy of patient non-engagement, and he moved through their apartment with the practiced ease of someone who has learned which currents to swim with and which to rat around. I liked him very much. He made things feel slightly more habitable just by existing in them. Those Sunday dinners smelled like Valentina's borscht, which was genuinely excellent, a deep garnet-colored broth that she served with a precision-dolloped spoonful of sour cream and fresh dill, the kind of borscht that ruins you for all other borscht, and underneath it, faintly, the dry warm smell of the old radiators that clanked and hissed through the apartment's heating system. I always brought dessert. It was a small, consistent ritual I had established early in the marriage, showing up with a cake box from the bakery near our apartment or, when I had the energy for it, something I'd made myself. Valentina always received these offerings with a slightly puzzled expression, as if she couldn't quite understand why someone would go to that trouble. She never said thank you in a way that felt like it cost her anything. She would set the cake on the counter and resume whatever she was doing, and I would set my coat on the hook in the hall and go to help in the kitchen, and the dinner would proceed, and I would drive home afterward with the low-grade, formless fatigue that I had come to think of as my normal Sunday evening state. The container of Kefir was the thing that started as a symbol and ended as one. I had a ritual with Kefir that had nothing to do with his mother. I had been buying the same brand from the same refrigerated shelf for 3 years, a full-fat version from a small local creamery that came in a plain white container with a blue label, and I drank a glass of it most mornings with my coffee because I liked the slight tartness and it kept me from being hungry until noon. It was one of those small personal rituals that constitute the invisible architecture of a life, so ordinary that you stop noticing it until someone tries to disrupt it, and then the disruption feels disproportionately significant. I mention it now because that Kefir was the thing I was holding in the crook of my arm when I understood, with the sudden, total clarity of someone who has finally focused a camera that was blurry for years, exactly what kind of woman Valentina was and exactly what kind of life I had been financing for her. But I am getting ahead of myself again. That moment comes. For now, the Kefir was just Kefir, and I was just Mara, and the life I was living felt like my own. The financial trouble started, or rather, I became aware that it had been going on for some time, in the first week of September, 3 months before the divorce proceedings began in earnest. Daniel came home on a Tuesday evening in September with takeout curry that he'd picked up without being asked, which was a sign he wanted something, because he only brought unrequested takeout when he was about to ask me for something he wasn't sure I'd agree to. I recognized the pattern the way you recognize a weather system by the particular quality of the light before it arrives. We ate dinner, and the curry was good, and he talked about a project at work that was giving him trouble with the soil composition data, and I told him about a client meeting that had gone sideways over color palettes, and at the end of the meal, when we were both cradling mugs of tea at the kitchen table, he set his mug down and looked at the table rather than at me, and said, "I need to talk to you about my parents." The conversation that followed was careful and methodical, which was how Daniel approached all difficult conversations. He built them like he built structures, with a clear foundation and load-bearing points distributed at regular intervals. His parents were in financial difficulty, he explained. His father had retired in the spring and their pension income was fixed. There had been some unexpected expenses, a maintenance assessment for their building's elevator renovation, some dental work for Oleg that the insurance hadn't fully covered, a car repair. Daniel had been helping them in small ways here and there, he said, nothing major, but he thought it would make sense to formalize it a bit, to set up a monthly contribution so they could plan around it. He named the figure, $300 a month. He said a few months, just until things stabilize. He said it the way you say something when you believe it, but I noticed, the way you notice a smell before you can name it, that he said a few months with more conviction than precision. I said yes. I said yes because he was my husband and they were his parents, and $300, while not nothing, was something we could absorb, and because I had spent 4 years training myself to say yes to things that were within the range of reasonable, so that when I eventually said no to something unreasonable, I would have the moral currency to spend. I said yes and I meant it, and the transfer started the following week, clean and automatic, $300 on the first of each month from our joint account into a separate account Daniel managed. Valentina never acknowledged it. Not a word to me, not a thank you, not a we appreciate it across the Sunday dinner table. When I mentioned this to Daniel, gently, in passing, he said she was probably embarrassed about needing help, that she had her pride. He said it as if her pride were a feature rather than a mechanism, as if it were a quality to be respected rather than a tool she deployed consistently and strategically in her own interest. I let it go. I was good at letting things go. I had been practicing for years. But I want to tell you about the Sunday dinners during those early months, because there is something in them that matters, not in any single moment but in the accumulation, the way a particular smell becomes a memory not through one encounter but through dozens. The dinners hadn't changed in their structure, but something about Valentina had shifted slightly, in the way a person shifts when they feel their position has been secured. She was warmer with me, in a way that was almost more uncomfortable than her usual cool appraisal. She touched my arm more, asked questions about my work that seemed genuinely interested, told me the dessert was beautiful when I brought a plum cake in October, actually beautiful, which was the first unqualified compliment she had offered in 4 years of Sunday dinners. She called me darling once, which she had never done before. I noticed all of this and told myself it was the arrangement working as intended, that the financial support was easing a stress that had been creating friction, that we were, perhaps, finally finding our footing. I told myself this because it was easier than the alternative explanation, which I was not ready to look at directly yet. The phone calls began in October. Not to me, to Daniel, always when he was at work, always just him, always during hours I had no way of knowing the content of. I noticed them only because Daniel began mentioning them in passing, in the way he mentioned things he wanted on the record but didn't want to make into discussions. His mother needed someone to accompany her to an appointment for Oleg, nothing serious, a follow-up with the cardiologist, but she got turned around in the hospital system and Daniel was the one who knew how to handle those things. 2 weeks later, there was a problem with the building management about the elevator assessment documentation, some discrepancy that needed someone to go in person and sort out, and since Daniel's name was on the original paperwork from years ago, it made sense for him to go. Then, a utility billing error that required a call center hold time that Valentina found distressing. Could Daniel call on her behalf? Then, a package requiring a signature during the window when she had a conflicting appointment. Could he be there? Each request was individually reasonable. This is the particular genius of a person who understands how to extract resources from others. They never ask for anything that, in isolation, sounds unreasonable. They ask for things that sound like the natural minimum a loving son would provide, and they ask for them in a sequence rapid enough to constitute a campaign but spread out enough that each individual request can plausibly be called a coincidence. I watched Daniel's calendar that October the way you watch water rising, slowly, incrementally, each individual inch unremarkable, until you notice the furniture is already wet. He took a half-day off work for the cardiologist appointment. He spent a full Saturday morning at the building management office sorting out the elevator documentation. He spent 2 evenings on hold with the utility company. He drove over on a Thursday afternoon to accept the package delivery. He said nothing about any of it as a pattern. He mentioned each instance as a discrete event, handled and resolved. But I had been watching, and I had the pattern in my peripheral vision even when I was pretending to look elsewhere, and the small, cool, pebble-like feeling in my sternum that I had been carrying since September had grown, almost imperceptibly, into something the size of a fist. The phone call that changed everything came on a Wednesday morning in the last week of October. I was working from home, deep into a logo revision for a client who had very strong opinions about the emotional weight of specific shades of green, and my phone lit up on the desk beside my laptop. Valentina's name. I felt the familiar shoulder tightening, the Pavlovian response to that name on my screen, and I answered because not answering would have required an explanation I wasn't ready to give. "Mara, my dear," she said, in the particular tone she used when she wanted something and had decided warmth was the correct approach. Her voice was perfectly modulated, not too urgent, not too casual. "I hope I'm not disturbing your work." She said this in the way of someone who knows they are disturbing your work and has calculated that the social acknowledgement of the disturbance is sufficient to neutralize it. I told her I had a moment. She said she had been thinking about us spending some time together, just the two of us, that she'd realized we never really had the chance to do that, and she'd heard about a specialty grocery store near her that had just opened, imported products, the kind of place that was really worth a visit, and she thought Saturday might be nice. She said it the way you say something that is already decided, not asking, exactly, but framing the invitation so that declining it would require active effort and produce social consequences. I thought of my Saturday, of the garden that needed cutting back before the first frost came, of the book I'd been trying to finish for 6 weeks, of the particular quality of Saturday morning quiet in my kitchen with good coffee and no agenda. I said yes anyway, because declining would require an explanation, and explanations required energy I was conserving for something I couldn't yet name. She was dressed in her good coat when I picked her up, the charcoal wool one with the large buttons that she wore to things she considered occasions, with her silver hair perfect and lipstick applied. Oleg answered the door in his usual cardigan, a little pale but otherwise himself, and he patted my shoulder and told me to take care of his girl, meaning Valentina, with the fond exasperation of someone who has been taking care of the same person for 40 years and is fully aware that she does not need it and will never admit to wanting it. The drive to the store took 12 minutes, during which Valentina told me about a friend named Lyoba whose daughter was getting married, which would have been interesting conversation if I had been listening to it, but I was mostly focused on the particular quality of Valentina's manner, more animated than usual, a brightness about her that I had learned, over the years, to read as the brightness of someone moving towards something they want. I thought she was simply excited about the store. I thought I was imagining things. I thought a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. The store itself was the kind of specialty grocery that markets itself on curated origin stories and amber lighting and wide plank wooden floors that smell faintly of beeswax. Everything in it came from somewhere specific and was packaged to emphasize the specificity. This olive oil from a particular valley in Sicily, this honey from hives kept by a family in rural Georgia, this cheese aged in a specific cave in a region of France that had apparently been making cheese in that cave for 300 years. I found it slightly exhausting in the way that very self-conscious environments are exhausting, but Valentina moved through it with immediate, proprietary ease. She moved the way people move through spaces that confirm their sense of themselves. She picked up packages and read labels with focused attention, and I noticed, very early, that she had taken one of the store's shopping baskets from the entrance and was carrying it herself, and that items were going into it. Not dramatically. Not all at once. She paused at the preserved food section and examined tins of caviar with the careful deliberation of an appraiser, and I watched her pick up a flat silver and blue tin, turn it over, read the back, and place it in the basket. I looked at the price on the shelf tag, $47 for 4 ounces. I was holding my Kefir in the crook of my arm. I had found it near the entrance, plain white container, blue label, same brand, $3.90, and I held it a little tighter. I want to tell you exactly what I felt in that moment, because a bad feeling doesn't do it justice, and I promised myself when I started telling this story that I would be precise. It was not yet alarm. It was more like the feeling you get when you're reading a sentence and you realize, about 2/3 of the way through, that it's going to end somewhere you didn't expect, a kind of preparatory bracing, a recalibration of what you're about to need to manage. I told myself she was buying the caviar for herself and would pay for it herself, and this was simply an opportunity to observe the kind of shopping she did when she had access to a store she liked. I told myself this with the conviction of someone who already suspects the opposite is true. She moved to the cheese counter. A young man with a patient face and a wax-coated apron stood behind it, and Valentina engaged him in a conversation about aging processes and milk origin that lasted, I timed it internally, approximately 7 minutes. She tasted 2 samples. She selected a wedge of something described as mountain cave aged at $23 for a modest triangular portion and placed it in the basket. Then the wine aisle. She stood in front of the bottles with her head slightly tilted the way she tilted it when she was reading fine print or calculating something, and she pulled a dark bottle of Georgian amber wine from the shelf, $36, and placed it alongside the caviar and the cheese. Then, on the way to the register, she added a small jar of saffron, a tin of smoked fish, a package of specialty crackers and a cloth bag. She moved through the store with the unhurried confidence of someone who has already decided that the bill at the end is not her concern. At the register, the cashier was a young woman with box braids and a practiced scanning rhythm, and she moved through the items efficiently while Valentina watched the screen with the expression of someone watching a performance they are mildly pleased with. The total assembled itself on the display, $172.40. And then Valentina turned to me. She turned to me the way you turn to someone who you have always assumed would handle something, the way you turn to a member of your own staff, with expectation so complete and so natural that it didn't even arrange itself into a request. It was simply an orientation. Her body turned toward me, and her eyes found me, and there was no question in them. There was only the assumption. "I seem to have left my wallet at home," she said, pleasantly. Not apologetically. Not with any visible discomfort. Pleasantly, as if she were reporting a minor weather observation. The cashier with the box braids had very deliberately turned her attention to the items on the counter. I noticed that she did not look up. I noticed that her hands had stilled slightly. I noticed, in the particular heightened awareness state that I seemed to have entered without choosing to, the faint hum of the refrigeration units along the back wall, the smell of the store, beeswax and aged cheese and something herbal, and the weight of the Kefir container in my arm, cool and slightly damp with condensation. Something happened inside me then that I have thought about many times since. It was not anger, not yet. Anger came later, in waves, over the weeks that followed. What happened in that moment was quieter and more absolute than anger. It was the feeling you get when a picture that has been slightly crooked on the wall for so long you've stopped seeing it is suddenly, definitively, knocked straight, and you realize the crookedness was the whole problem all along. Everything that had been slightly off for 4 years, the perfume in my cushions, the opinions delivered as gifts, the Sunday dinners where I brought dessert and was thanked with a puzzled look, the $300 a month, the phone calls, the reorientation of Daniel's calendar, the warmth of October that felt purchased rather than genuine, all of it resolved in that single moment of Valentina's pleasant, expectant turn into something I could finally see clearly and completely and without any remaining ambiguity at all. I placed my Kefir container on the conveyor belt. I took out my card. I looked at the cashier's face, which was professionally neutral but contained, I thought, a very careful attention. "Just mine," I said, to the cashier. She scanned the Kefir. $3.90. I tapped my card on the reader, heard the small confirming beep, and picked up my bag. And then I walked out. I did not look at Valentina as I turned. I did not say anything further. I simply picked up my bag with the Kefir container inside it, and I walked past the register and through the automatic doors and into the parking lot, where the October air hit me cold and clean after the warm amber interior of the store. I stood by my car for a moment. My hands were not shaking. I noticed this specifically. I had half expected them to be shaking, but they weren't. They were steady in the way that hands are steady when a decision has already been made and the body has caught up to it. My breathing was slow. My vision was very clear. I got into the car, closed the door, and sat for a moment in the silence, with the cold outside and the warmth inside and the Kefir in the bag on the passenger seat, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. My phone buzzed. I looked at the screen. Valentina. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat and started the car. I drove home. And I want to make clear what I was thinking during those 12 minutes, because it matters. I was not in a rage, I was not catastrophizing, I was not rehearsing speeches. I was thinking, with a clarity I hadn't felt in months, that I needed to look at our bank account statements. that I needed to look at all of them. That I needed to understand, before I did anything else, exactly how long this had been happening and exactly how much it had cost me, because I had a feeling, the cold, certain, irrefutable kind of feeling that arrives when your body knows something your mind is still processing, that the grocery store had not been an aberration. It had been a test. And every other arrangement I'd thought was normal might, when examined in the light of that test, turn out to be something else entirely. Daniel was at work. I had the house to myself. I made coffee, strong, black, the kind I only made when I needed to be very awake for something unpleasant, and sat at my desk and opened the banking app. I was systematic about it. I started with the joint checking account and I went back 8 months. What I found in the first pass was what I'd expected, the $300 transfers to Daniel's parents' account, beginning in September, clean and regular. What I found in the second pass, going further back, was what I had not expected and what reconfigured everything I thought I understood. There were additional transfers. Smaller, irregular, appearing sporadically in the months before September, $80 in June, $140 in July, $220 in August. No pattern to the amounts, but a pattern to the timing, always on a weekday, always in the morning, always during hours when I was working and not watching. I stared at those 3 rows of numbers for a long time. The coffee went cold in my hand. I set it down without drinking it and kept scrolling. And then I found the thing that made the coffee go truly irrelevant, the thing that made the muscles in my lower back seize up suddenly, hard, like someone had grabbed a fistful of muscle and twisted, the withdrawal from our renovation savings account. Not the joint checking. The savings account. The dedicated one, the one I had named Studio Fund in the banking app because I had been specific about what I was building toward. 6 weeks prior. A single withdrawal of $4,800. Gone in one transaction, on a Tuesday morning when I had been on a call with the Green Palette client and had not checked the account because I had no reason to think I needed to. $4,800. We had been $1,100 away from our target. The account now had $1,012 in it. Someone had taken nearly everything we'd saved and left just enough that if you weren't paying close attention, you might not notice immediately. I closed the app. I set my phone on the desk and I looked at the window and the garden beyond it, and I breathed deliberately, one breath at a time, because the alternative was something I couldn't afford. The birch tree at the back of the garden had dropped most of its leaves, and the remaining ones were yellow gold against the gray sky, and I watched 2 of them release in the same moment and fall in different directions, and I thought, he took the renovation money. He took it without telling me and he gave it to his parents and he came home that evening and ate dinner and talked about his day and said nothing. He had looked at my Studio Fund account, my account, the one I had been building for 14 months, the one I talked about with specific excitement when we discussed what the second bedroom would become, and he had made a calculation that I would not look, and he had taken it. I sat for what might have been 20 minutes and might have been an hour. Then I picked up my phone and called my friend Celeste. She had been my closest friend since college, and she was pragmatic in the way that very good friends are pragmatic. She would not tell me what I wanted to hear, she would tell me what I needed to hear, and she would do it without drama and without catastrophizing. She was also, by professional coincidence that now felt more like Providence, a paralegal at a family law firm downtown. She picked up on the second ring. "I need you to listen to me without interrupting," I said, "and I need you to not tell me to calm down, because I am calm, I am very calm, and I need that to stay the case while I talk." She said she understood. And then I told her. The grocery store, the cart, the $172, Valentina's pleasant expectation, my Kefir, my departure. The bank statements. The 8 months of irregular transfers before September. The $300 a month. And last, the $4,800 from the Studio Fund, because I needed someone else to hear it out loud before I was willing to fully believe it was real. When I finished, there was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds, which from Celeste was the equivalent of a long pause. "Okay," she said, finally. "How far back did you look in the joint account?" I told her 8 months. She said to go back further. She said to go back a year and a half and look at every charge I couldn't immediately account for and send her the screenshots. She also said, and this was the part that sat heaviest in my sternum, that the savings withdrawal was the most serious item on the list, because a joint account means both parties have equal legal access to the funds, which meant Daniel hadn't technically stolen anything, but in the context of a marriage, taking nearly $5,000 from a dedicated savings account without discussion or disclosure was a specific and documentable pattern of financial behavior, and that pattern was going to matter. Get a consultation with an attorney, she said. Not because you're getting divorced. Because you need to understand what your options are before you decide anything. I said I would. She said she'd text me a name. She said, before she hung up, Mara. You are not crazy. This is real. I told her I knew. I had known since the cashier scanned my Kefir. I had known, if I was honest with myself, much longer than that. I did go back further in the accounts. A year and a half, then 2 years, then back to the beginning of our marriage. What I found was not a single dramatic revelation but something more like geological evidence, layers of small, regular extractions that had been happening so consistently, in amounts so calibrated to stay below the level of immediate alarm, that they had accumulated over time into a total that was genuinely startling. Not all of it went to his parents, some charges were ordinary, identifiable household expenses that I simply hadn't been tracking closely because I had trusted him to track them. But a conservative accounting of what I couldn't identify and attribute to normal household spending came to, over 4 years, approximately $14,000. That number sat in my chest like a stone for the rest of the day. I made another cup of coffee that I also didn't drink. I called no one else. I simply sat with the number and let it be real, because I had learned that there is a certain kind of difficult truth that you have to let land fully before you can decide what to do with it. If you rush to action before the landing is complete, you make decisions from the wrong position. Daniel came home at 6:30. He brought takeout again, Thai this time, which I also typically liked, and he set it on the counter and kissed my cheek and asked how my day was, and I said fine, which was the most efficient lie I had told in years. We ate. I was quiet, but I was often quiet after long workdays, and he didn't probe. He watched something on his phone while we ate, some sports recap, and afterward he did the dishes, which he did most nights, and then he sat with me on the couch and asked if I wanted to watch anything, and I said I was tired and thought I'd read, and I went upstairs with my book and did not read a single word of it. I lay in bed and listened to him moving around the house, the sounds of ordinary domestic life, the particular creak of the third step on the stairs, the sound of his phone charger being plugged in, the exhale of the bathroom door closing, and thought about the fact that I had been married to someone for 4 years and I was only now understanding the full picture of what that had cost me. He came to bed around 11. He fell asleep quickly and easily, which he always did, a biological gift I had always envied and tonight found difficult to be near. I lay awake beside him and looked at the ceiling and thought, not in circles, not with the cycling anxiety that insomnia usually produces, but with a strange, still clarity. I thought about the Kefir container in the refrigerator downstairs. I thought about Valentina's pleasant, expectant turn at the register, the certainty in it, the total absence of doubt. I thought about the phrase "I love you like my own daughter" and what it had actually meant, operationally, over 4 years. It had meant I love having access to you, I love that your money is available to me through my son, I love that you have been trained to be accommodating enough that you will absorb costs without protest. It had not been an expression of affection. It had been a terms of service agreement that I had never signed but had been held to anyway. I got up at 5 in the morning. I went downstairs in the dark, stepping carefully around the 3rd stair, and made coffee in the kitchen with only the under-cabinet light on, a warm, narrow strip of yellow that fell across the counter and left most of the room in soft dark. I stood at the counter with my coffee and I looked at the garden through the window, which was invisible in the pre-dawn except for the pale shape of the birch tree against slightly lighter sky. And I made decisions. Specific, sequential decisions, the way you make plans when you have accepted the situation you're in and are ready to move through it rather than around it. I was going to open a personal savings account in my name only and redirect my direct deposit to it. I was going to consult an attorney, the one Celeste had texted me, a family law specialist named Patricia Chen. I was going to have a conversation with Daniel about the bank statements before I did anything formal, because I believed, and still believe, that there are things that deserve to be said between two people before they are said through intermediaries. And I was going to have a conversation with Valentina, but that one I was going to plan very carefully, because I was done having conversations with her on her terms, in her space, with the social architecture configured in her favor. The conversation with Daniel happened the following evening. I had spent the day working, genuinely working. The green palette logo situation had resolved itself in a way I was pleased with, and I had printed the bank statements, 3 months of them, highlighted in yellow the transactions that required explanation. I placed them on the kitchen table before he got home and made tea, because I always made tea when I was managing something difficult, and waited. When he came in, he saw me at the table, saw the papers, and his body did the thing it did when he recognized that something was coming, a very slight deceleration, a reset of posture, the body's instinctive preparation for structural stress. The kitchen light above the table was warm and steady, and outside the window the garden was dark, and I heard Daniel set his bag down by the door and come to the table and stand there, looking at the pages I had spread across it, and I looked at him and I said, quietly, "Sit down. I need to talk to you about our money." He sat. He looked at the highlighted statements. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the refrigerator's hum became audible, that steady domestic drone I had learned to associate with silence that was fuller than it looked. "Okay," he said. He said it with the particular weight of someone who already knows at least part of what is coming. "Tell me about these transfers," I said, indicating the highlighted lines. "The ones before September. The irregular amounts." My voice was level. It was an effort, but the effort was worth it, because the conversation I was about to have required me to be steady in order for him to understand that I was serious and not reactive, that I had thought this through, that I was not going to be managed. He looked at the pages. He folded his hands on the table, and I noticed that his knuckles were slightly pale, which was the equivalent of a tell from Daniel. He rarely showed physical signs of stress, but his hands gave him away when the stress was deep enough. "My parents needed help before September," he said. "I was helping them. I should have told you about it." He said it carefully, each clause landing with deliberate weight. "I know I should have. I didn't because I told myself it was small amounts, that you wouldn't notice, that I'd tell you when we talked about the formal arrangement." He paused. "I know how that sounds." "I need you to tell me about the studio fund," I said. The pause that followed was different in quality from the ones before it. Heavier. More loaded, the way air gets before a pressure change. "My parents' building had a maintenance assessment," he said. "The elevator renovation. The bill came faster than expected. They didn't have it." He stopped. He pressed his lips together, and his jaw shifted slightly, and I watched him make the decision to continue, which I think was the hardest decision he'd made in a long time. "I took it from the studio fund. I thought we could rebuild it. I was going to tell you. I was going to replace it before you noticed the target was off." He looked up at me. I know that doesn't make it better." I let that sit for a moment. I had known it was coming, had known it logically since I'd seen the withdrawal, had spent 24 hours preparing for this confirmation, and still, hearing him say it, the cold feeling in my back arrived again, climbing from the base of my spine upward, systematic and thorough. "Daniel," I said. "That's $4,800. From an account I built specifically for something we planned together. Without telling me. Because you thought you could replace it before I noticed." I paused. "Do you understand what you're describing?" He said he did. I said, "Your mother told you to use it, didn't she?" It wasn't a question. His stillness when I said it was the answer, the kind of answer that doesn't need words because the body has already delivered it. He confirmed it a moment later. "She had mentioned, when the assessment came up, that we had a renovation savings account, that surely the renovation could wait, that family comes first. She had said family comes first while describing a plan to raid my savings account, and he had let her frame it that way, and he had done it. What followed was a long conversation that I will not reproduce in its entirety because some of it belongs only to the two of us, but the important facts of it are these: Daniel admitted to the transfers, all of them, going back 2 years. The total, when we went through it with the statements spread across the table, was $11,430 over 4 years, not counting the $4,800 from the studio fund, making the total $16,230 that had left our joint finances in the direction of his parents without my knowledge or consent. He said, over the course of that conversation, the phrase "I should have told you" so many times that it lost its shape and became just sound, the way any phrase does when it's repeated past the point of meaning. I did not yell. I did not cry. My voice stayed even throughout, with an evenness that I know he found more alarming than tears would have been, because he said, at one point, "Mara, please, can you just," and I asked him what he wanted me to do, and he couldn't finish the sentence. I did not tell him, that evening, what I had already done and what I was planning to do. I told him I needed time to think. I told him to sleep in the guest room. He did, without arguing, which told me that he understood, on some level, that he had used up whatever credit of silent accommodation I had been extending to him, and that he was now operating without a safety net. The appointment with Patricia Chen was the following Thursday. Her office was downtown, in a building with dark lobby floors and a receptionist who brought coffee without being asked, as if she had learned through long experience that the people who came here needed something warm in their hands before they could speak clearly. I sat in the waiting room for 9 minutes with a cup of coffee I actually drank and a magazine I did not open, and then Patricia's assistant appeared and led me back through a hall that smelled of good paper and something faintly floral that was not Valentina's perfume and therefore did not tighten my shoulders. Patricia Chen was 50-something and compact, with the particular quality of attention that very good listeners have, a stillness, a sense that nothing you said was going to surprise her enough to derail her focus. She had reading glasses on a chain and a legal pad and a pen that she held but rarely used, as if she were deciding in real time whether any given piece of information was worth writing down. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked 3 precise questions: how long had we been married, were both names on the joint accounts, and was the renovation savings account joint or individual? I told her 4 years, yes, and joint, though I had contributed the majority of the balance. She made a small notation and then took off her glasses and looked at me directly. The withdrawal from the savings account is the most actionable item, she said. Legally, both parties in a marriage have equal right to funds in a joint account. But in the context of a divorce proceeding, unilateral financial decisions of this scale, made without the other spouse's knowledge, establish a pattern of economic behavior that courts take seriously. The fact that you've documented it across multiple years strengthens that picture considerably. She paused. Are you seeking a divorce? I told her I didn't know yet. She said that was fine, that understanding your position didn't commit you to any particular action, but that I should proceed as if I were, because that meant protecting my financial position regardless of the ultimate outcome. She recommended I redirect my salary to a personal account immediately, which I had already done. She recommended I keep comprehensive documentation, which I had. She recommended that any formal conversation I had with Daniel's parents, specifically any conversation about the money, happen in the presence of witnesses. I told her I had already been thinking about that. She looked at me over the glasses she'd put back on, with an expression that was not quite a smile but contained the same warmth. You came in here knowing exactly what you needed, she said. That makes my job easier. I told her it was the engineer's wife and me. She laughed, which was a sound that surprised both of us, and then we got back to work. I want to tell you about the Sunday I chose for the confrontation, because the choosing was deliberate, and the deliberateness was the whole point. Valentina's power was most complete in intimate settings, one-on-one, or in her own home, where the social architecture was configured to her advantage, and I was always, structurally, a guest. What I needed was a setting in which she was the guest, where the space belonged to me, and where there were people present whose presence would require her to perform at a level of consistency she could not maintain under genuine pressure. I invited Valentina and Oleg to our home for Sunday brunch, which I framed to Daniel as an opportunity to talk through the financial arrangements as a family, a phrase I used deliberately, borrowing her own language, weaponizing it the way she had always weaponized it against me. I also invited Celeste, telling Daniel that I wanted a friend present for support, which was true and was also only part of the truth. And I called Oleg privately, 2 days before, not to strategize, not to recruit him, but because I believed he deserved to know what had been happening and to know it from me before it became a confrontation, so that he could prepare himself and not be blindsided. He was quiet on the phone when I told him. Very quiet, the way a person is quiet when something is confirming a suspicion they have been hoping was wrong. She mentioned the renovation fund to me, he said, finally. When Daniel told us he was going to help with the assessment. She said she had suggested it to Daniel and he had agreed. I asked her if she had checked with you and she said, he stopped. She said that you and Daniel made financial decisions together and that Daniel had made this one. A pause. I didn't push it further. I should have. His voice was weighted with a specific kind of regret that is heavier than ordinary guilt, the regret of a person who has spent decades choosing the path of least resistance and is reckoning, perhaps for the first time, with what that choice accumulated into. I told him I wasn't calling to assign blame. I told him I was calling because he deserved to know, and because I thought he might want to know before Sunday. He said he would be there. He said, just before we hung up, something that I have thought about many times since, Mara. You have been patient with our family for a long time. I have noticed it, even when it seemed like no one did. I told him that meant something. It did. Sunday came in overcast and still, the particular still of late October that feels like held breath. I made a full brunch, a mushroom and Gruyere frittata, roasted tomatoes, the good sourdough from the bakery on the corner, a fruit salad I put together with more care than was strictly necessary because cooking is the thing I do when I need to feel competent and in control of something. I set the dining table with the white linen tablecloth, the one I only used for occasions, and I put a small vase of the last garden roses in the center, 3 of them, pale pink, still holding against the season. I laid 5 places. I put the file folder I had prepared, the printed statements, the documentation, the consultation notes, in the cabinet beside the dining room door, where I could reach it without ceremony. Daniel watched me do all of this with the expression of a structural engineer observing a building he cannot immediately classify, trying to determine what load it was built to bear. They arrived at 11. Oleg first, holding a small jar of honey he'd brought from the market, looking more tired than usual and more deliberate. He kissed my cheek and pressed my hand briefly, and in that pressure was everything he couldn't say in front of Valentina, who was directly behind him in her charcoal coat and perfect hair, bringing with her a wave of the perfume that still, even now, tightened my shoulders. But I breathed through it and smiled and stepped back to let them in, and the house smelled like frittata and coffee and the roses, and I thought, this is my space, and I am ready. Celeste arrived 8 minutes later. I had asked her to time it that way, to give me the room settled before she came in, and she was warm and easy to like and immediately found common ground with Oleg about winter gardening, and for 20 minutes the brunch table felt almost like something other than what it was. I waited until the frittata had been served and eaten before I reached into the cabinet and brought out the folder. The sound of it landing on the table was very quiet. Just paper on cloth. But it produced a specific quality of attention from everyone at the table, Celeste already knowing, Oleg having been prepared, Daniel going very still, and Valentina's hand, which had been reaching for the bread basket, stopping mid-reach with a precision that told me her body had understood before her face did. I want to talk about our finances, I said. All of us, together, because I think it's been handled privately for long enough and the privacy hasn't been serving anyone well. I opened the folder and placed the first sheet on the table, the joint account summary, 16 months, the irregular transfer circled in red. I kept my voice completely level, Because I had practiced this, not the words exactly, but the tone, the steadiness, the absence of anger that would have let anyone dismiss what I was saying as emotional. I found these in our joint account records. Transfers to Valentina and Oleg's account going back 2 years, before the formal arrangement Daniel and I discussed in September. Totaling, with the September through October regular payments, $11,400. The table was very quiet. The refrigerator in the kitchen hummed its steady domestic note. Valentina had lowered her hand from the bread basket and placed it flat on the table, and her expression had assumed the configuration it went to when she was managing something in real time, composed, attentive, impossible to read from the outside. And this, I said, placing the second sheet, the studio fund statement. This is our renovation savings account. I've been building this for 14 months. On a Tuesday 6 weeks ago, $4,800 was withdrawn. I was not informed of this withdrawal. I did not consent to it. The money was used to pay your building's elevator assessment. At the suggestion, I looked at Valentina directly, of someone at this table who knew about the account specifically because I had mentioned it in passing at a family dinner and who saw in its existence an opportunity. I paused. I'd like someone to tell me I've described that incorrectly. The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. Oleg, to my left, was looking at his plate. Celeste, across from me, was looking at the middle distance with the careful attention of a very good witness. Daniel, beside me, had both hands flat on the table and was looking at Valentina with an expression I had not seen on him before, not anger, but something harder than that, something that had made its way through several layers of lifelong accommodation and arrived at a place I could only call clarity. Valentina unfolded her hands from the table and refolded them in her lap. She looked at me with the expression of someone deciding which version of themselves to deploy, which tool from the arsenal of a woman who had been managing difficult situations through social performance for 63 years. I watched her go through them in sequence, the warmth, which didn't come, then the pained misunderstanding, which she tried briefly but which couldn't land because the numbers were on the table, then something harder, something that arrived in the set of her jaw and the very slight cooling of her eyes, which was the real Valentina, the one behind the chignon and the perfume, the one that had been running calculations for 63 years while presenting as someone who simply loved everyone around her very much. "We are family," she said. Her voice was low and controlled, each word placed carefully. "Daniel is my son. What Daniel chooses to do with his money." "Our money," I said, with the particular quietness that is louder than a shout. "Daniel and I have joint finances. What Daniel does with our money is a decision that requires my knowledge and my consent. We can disagree about many things, but on that point there is no interpretation." I reached into the folder and placed a third sheet, the summary Celeste had helped me compile, a clean breakdown of the total financial impact over 4 years. The total, including the studio fund withdrawal, is $21,030. I have documentation for every item on this list. I have also had a consultation with a family law attorney, and I want you to understand that what is on this table right now is not an accusation. It is a record. It exists. It will continue to exist regardless of what happens at this table today. Valentina's composure underwent a change that was so controlled it was almost invisible. Almost. But I had been watching her face across Sunday dinner tables for 4 years and I knew every register of it, and what I saw now was the particular tightening around the eyes that happened when she felt her position shifting, when the ground under her moved and she had to recalculate. "Mara," she said, and her voice had taken on a quality I had not heard from her before, not warm, not cold, but careful, the voice of someone who has realized, perhaps for the first time, that they are in a negotiation rather than a performance, and that the rules of a negotiation require different tools than the rules of a performance. "You've clearly been upset about this for some time. I understand that. I appreciate that you've brought it to the table rather than—" "I want 3 things," I said, interrupting her with such complete calm that it stopped her mid-sentence and held her there. She waited. "First, the renovation fund is restored to its full balance. all $4,800, within 30 days. Second, the monthly transfers stop. If Daniel and I choose to help his parents with specific, identified expenses, that decision will be made together, explicitly, with both names on it. Not handled through Daniel alone, not invisible, not discussed at family dinners as if I weren't a party to it. I looked at her steadily. Third, you look me in the eye right now and you tell me, using actual words, that you understood what you were doing when you suggested to your son that he use our savings account to cover your building assessment without telling me. Not that you're sorry if I'm upset. Not that it was a misunderstanding. That you knew. The table was absolutely still. Oleg had looked up from his plate. Celeste was very carefully not moving. Daniel had turned to look at his mother with an expression that I will not try to characterize because it contained too many things at once, love and grief and something resolving in real time that had been unresolved for 30 years. Valentina looked at me for a long time. Her hands were in her lap and her posture was perfectly erect and her face had passed through every available configuration and arrived, finally, at something unguarded that I had never seen on it before. It was not quite remorse. It was too old and too complicated for remorse, which is a clean emotion. It was more like the expression of someone who has been caught not in an act but in a way of being, a fundamental orientation toward the world that they have operated from for so long it has become invisible to them, and is now suddenly, irreversibly visible. Yes, she said. I knew. Oleg made a small sound that was not a word. It was not directed at anyone. It was simply the sound a person makes when something they had half known and half refused to know becomes fully and undeniably real. Thank you, I said. That is all I needed from you. I closed the folder. I picked up my coffee, which had gone cold during the conversation, and I looked across the table at my husband. Daniel. The renovation fund. 30 days. He said yes. He said it quietly and without caveat, and it was the clearest thing he had said to me in months. What happened in the weeks after that Sunday followed the pattern of all real consequences, which is to say it was neither clean nor dramatic but slow and thorough, the way weather changes a landscape. Daniel replaced the studio fund money in 3 weeks, not 30 days. He sold a piece of equipment he'd been keeping for a project that hadn't materialized and wrote the transfer himself and showed me the confirmation without being asked. The monthly transfer stopped entirely. The formal conversation about what help, if any, Daniel's parents would receive going forward happened on a Tuesday evening at our kitchen table with printed budgets and named amounts and both of us signing a piece of paper that meant nothing legally but meant everything as a document of mutual agreement. The number we landed on was $120 a month, designated specifically for Oleg's physical therapy co-pays, reviewed quarterly, subject to change. Valentina was not at that conversation because it was not her conversation to be at, it was between Daniel and me, as it had always been, as it should have been from the beginning. Valentina did not call me for 6 weeks after the Sunday brunch. When she eventually called, she called Daniel first, and then, 3 days later, me. The call was brief. She asked how I was, I said I was well, she said the brunch had been good, and we both understood that this was not a conversation about the brunch. It was the phone call that re-established contact, nothing more. I was cordial. I was not warm. Warmth is something you earn, and she understood now that the currency for it had changed. The attorney consultation had prepared me for a possible divorce and I had been prepared to pursue it, but that was not where we landed, Daniel and I. What we landed on was harder and slower and, I think, more honest than divorce. We had a series of conversations, 7 or 8 of them over 2 months, that were the most direct and uncomfortable conversations of our marriage, and at the end of them we had a marriage that was structurally different from the one we'd had before. Different in specific, named ways. Finances were discussed and agreed upon, not managed by one party and absorbed by the other. His parents were a subject we could address directly without the diplomatic detours I had always navigated. I was allowed to say no to things that were asked of me, without those refusals being processed as a failure of character. These sound like minimum requirements for a functional marriage, and they are, which tells you something about what we had been operating at before. We were not operating at the minimum. But we were closer to it than I had known. There is a thing that happens when you look clearly at a situation you have been looking away from for a long time. It does not make the past different. You cannot revise 4 years of quiet, incremental self-erasure by having one confrontation at a Sunday brunch table, no matter how carefully prepared. What you can do is change the present, which changes the future, which is where you actually live. I changed mine on an October Saturday in a specialty grocery store, holding a $3.90 container of Kefir while a woman who had been charging admission to my own life for 4 years waited for me to pay for her caviar. I changed it when I put my Kefir on the belt and tapped my card and picked up my bag. I changed it when I walked through those automatic doors and the October air hit me cold and clean and my hands were steady. 6 months after that Saturday, I was in the finished studio. The room was everything I had imagined it, shelves along the north wall floor to ceiling, the glass panel door that let the hall light come through without disturbing the work, the window seat with 3 small plants on it that I kept alive with inconsistent but genuine effort, the electrical outlets in the right places so that my setup ran without the octopus of power strips. It smelled like fresh paint and coffee and very faintly like the lavender I had planted along the garden path below the window. I was working on a brand identity project that I was genuinely proud of, and my morning coffee was beside me in my favorite mug, heavy white ceramic, a small chip on the rim that I'd been meaning to replace for a year and now had decided I liked. Oleg had called the evening before, ostensibly to ask a gardening question about his balcony tomatoes, and had ended the conversation by saying "You did right, Mara. By all of us." I had told him I appreciated that. I had meant it. Valentina had not called since the previous week, a brief conversation about nothing in particular that contained, buried in its nothing in particular, a very small, very careful attempt at genuine connection, the first one I believed was genuine, and which I had received without encouraging and without refusing, because I was no longer in the business of absorbing what I couldn't afford or refusing what was freely and honestly given. I picked up my coffee with both hands, the way you hold something when you want to feel its warmth fully, and I looked at my studio, built with money that had been taken and returned and finally spent on what it was meant for, and I thought about the Kefir. It was in the refrigerator downstairs, same brand, same blue label, same creamery, same $3.90. In 14 months of building that fund, it had been the most ordinary item in my life. In the grocery store, it had been the clearest decision I had ever made. Now it was just Kefir again. But every time I poured a glass of it, the plain white container in my hand reminded me of the moment I understood that paying for other people's caviar was not love, that generosity is only generosity when it is chosen, and that the most important thing I had ever done for my marriage, my finances, and myself was to set my single item on a conveyor belt and pay exactly what it cost.